In this segment, we're going to take a look at a technique that's known as seeding. Now, there's no specific tool on the toolbar for this, but it's an editing technique that I thought I'd like to include in the DVD. So to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to create a simple satin line object. Now, the idea of seeding is that we can insert an object inside of the sewing sequence of this object. So this is a way of adding a new element of embroidery at a specific stitch point. You see, normally if I was to add another object right now, we could see that, for example, this object starts sewing right here. See, there's my thread jumps from the center of the hoop and it starts sewing right there. And this is where the object will finish sewing. Now, for example, if I drew a second object, placed it here, the thread would jump from the end of the first object to the beginning of the second object, and it would move from there. Now, of course, we have the ability, if we wanted to move the exit point of the first object to be here so that it will connect with this object. But you also have the ability to seed this new object within the sewing sequence, and so I was going to show how to do that. So let's just leave. Why don't we start? I guess what I'm going to do, I'm just going to select these two objects, Control A and delete. Okay, so we'll create a new object, satin line, and so you can see here that my needle is at the end of this object, and that's what this square and square represent, is your current location of your needle. And one of the tools in the toolbars that we've looked at is the traveling tools. And when you learn about the traveling tools, you'll see that we can jump by start end of design, jump by color, or jump by object. So just as an example, if I jump start end, these are the jumping buttons. If I jump to the beginning, everything turns black. See, my needle's sitting right here at the hoop center. If I click forward, it jumps to the end of the design, which is, of course, there's only one object in our design, so it jumps to the end of that object. And you can travel by color or by object. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how you can actually move needle position by using the arrow keys on your keyboard. So I don't have to do anything to start. I have nothing selected. I guess what I need to do is make sure that I don't have any objects selected. And the reason I say that is because if I select the object and then I touch on the arrow key on my keyboard, you'll notice it'll actually move that object over very slowly with it, so it's like nudging. But if I click off of the object so that I have nothing selected, and then I try doing the same thing, I'm just going to push the backwards arrow on my keyboard, and notice what happens? I'm moving backwards one stitch at a time. And as I go backwards, I'll just stop right there. So here's my needle. Everything that's prior to the needle is in color. Everything that's after the needle is in black. Now, if I push the forward arrow on my keyboard, I go forward in stitches. Backward arrow on my keyboard, backwards in stitches. If I push the down arrow on my keyboard, I go forward by 10 stitches. And if I push the up arrow on my keyboard, I can go backwards by 10 stitches. So you can see that I've currently moved my needle to exactly this place right here. Now, I'm going to go backwards even further, and then you'll see that we'll start to be in the underlay. So here I am right at the very beginning. Now I'm just going to go forward one stitch at a time. Jump, jump, jump. Now there's the stitching, and see it's going to travel. Right now it starts to place the underlay stitches. So what if I stop right there? Right at that spot. That's where my needle is. It's part of the run stitch underlay. And right now I'm going to click on my satin line tool, and I'm going to insert a satin line that just from here to, let's say, there. Hit enter. Now, the way the sewing goes now, it jumps from the center and it starts along that satin line, that run stitch underlay for the satin line. And when it gets right to this needle position, it walks underneath and it sews, well, first of all, the underlay for this satin line, and it completes sewing this satin line. Now, this satin line that I made, if I choose reshape on it, you can see that it starts sewing here and it finishes sewing up here. If I change my exit point to be back down here at the beginning again, look what happens. So now if I look really closely here, you can see that the stitches sew along this line, and they walk into this satin line, and they finish sewing this satin line, and they come back down. So if I go forward on my stitches, now we're back in that satin line. I'm going to jump to the beginning of the design. So let's watch it sew. I'm pushing on the arrows on my keyboard. It jumps from the hoop center, and it's starting to sew the run stitch underlay, the edge run underlay, and it gets right to that location, and it moves into this new object that I made, does the edge run for that object, and then it walks back to the far side and stitches down to the bottom. And I'm just pushing the arrow on my keyboard to move one stitch at a time so you can see exactly how this sews. And when it completes that satin line that we digitized, it just connects right back up with this that underlay of the object that we seated this under, and just going to hold my arrow key down, and you'll see that it'll finish sewing. And I can just hit, remember I'm on jump start end, so I'll just jump to the end. So there's my needle back here at the end, and I have seated this object inside of the sewing sequence of this object. Now, the two objects are still individually selectable, so I could select this object, and if I move this object away, you'll see that there's a jump from exactly this stitch in the underlay up to this object, and then from this object back down to that exact point in the underlay. So the idea is we were able to create a new object and seat it inside of the sewing sequence of a different object. So it's a different way of inserting embroidery, and it's a specific editing technique that you'll find can be helpful, especially when you start trying to edit existing designs and you just need to add a little piece, but you don't want it to add it at the end. You want to add it in between or right at a specific point, at a specific place in the design. Imagine trying to dot the I in lettering and not wanting to have to jump back to get that little dot over the I. You just wanted to insert it right at a specific point, and you want it to be from within the underlay. So anyway, the idea is you can move your needle position with the arrows on your keyboard, and while your needle position is moved to within an object, you can actually insert embroidery there. Now, you need to be careful when you do this type of editing technique. What I like to say is, when you move your stitches within a design, such as I have here, you can be checking your design for how it sews, or for whatever reason you moved that arrow. When you go to create new embroidery, be sure that you return to the end of the design. Otherwise, you'll be seating objects inside of your design. So the easiest way to move to the end of the design is to click on jump start end of the design and push the forward button, and it'll jump to the end of the design, and then I could go ahead and keep creating additional objects. But if you want to seat an object inside of another object, that's when you need to move this needle position. Okay, I hope I made that clear, and that's my segment about seating objects.